Now I would like to share with you a little bit about what God has done. Revival is starting in these Nordic countries. And I've seen signs, and I'd like to share some of these signs with you in the times that we're living in. There was, the Lord had put on my heart to pray with my children over the parliament in Finland and to pray for God's will to be done in the parliament, and that the message of God will go from the parliament to all of Finland. And I didn't know how he was going to do that, but then he gave me a vision of my children praying for the president, Martti Ahtisaarelle at that time. Because every night when I would put my children to bed, I told my children that it says in the Bible that we need to pray for our leaders and all those in authority, because all authority has been put by God. And so that my children would not go to sleep, this is when they were younger, until they prayed for Martti Ahtisaarelle and for Finland, the leaders of Finland. And so they learned to pray for the president. And so I saw in a vision one time that my children were writing the president a letter. And at this time I was away in Sweden. I wasn't in Finland, but my children and my wife were here. And I felt like the Lord was saying through this vision, I saw my children writing a letter of their prayer for the president and for Finland. And so I called my wife up and I said that I had this really strange dream that our children were writing the president a letter. And then we took that letter to the president's palace and gave it to Martti Ahtisaarelle. And it's something strange. My wife said that my daughter told her, she said that God spoke to me that I need to write a letter for the president. She didn't know how to write yet. I think she was 4 years old, 3 years old, between 3 and 4. And she didn't know how to write yet. So why would she say that I need to write a letter? And then she said that God showed me to. So she told this to her mother. And so then I told her what the vision that I had, that our children wrote these letters and brought it to the president. So when I came back to Finland, that's what we did. Our kids wrote a letter. Of course, my wife had to help my daughter write the letter because she didn't know how to write, what their prayer was for the president and for Finland. And then we took them to the president's palace. We couldn't actually meet the president, Martti Ahtisaarelle, but we gave those letters at the president's palace and prayed that he would get them. And my son had invited the president to come to his birthday party. And he was a little bit disappointed that Martti Ahtisaarelle didn't show up for his birthday party. But I said, presidents are really busy, and I'm sure that he would have loved to come. And then we went to the parliament, and we prayed over the parliament, like God showed us, that God's will would be done in the Finnish parliament. And that his word, his ways would be taught from the parliament. And then I told that to Antero Laukkasen, who was a good friend of mine. I spent a lot of time with Antero Laukkasen, nicknamed Moses, because we were in the same pastors' meeting groups, and also we were the first missionaries that Mayaka, he was the pastor of Mayaka Church. We were the first missionaries that they supported when we went to Sweden from Finland. So we had a really good relationship with them. And so I told Moses about, what the vision that I had to pray for the parliament and for Mark Ahtisaarelle, and then it was just a couple weeks after that he was asked by Toimi Kaukanimi to come and be his assistant, to be kind of like a pastor in the parliament. And then Antero Laukkasen asked me to come pray with him, because he just heard that I had prophesied or prayed over the parliament, that God's word would go out from the parliament. So Moses got me a new suit and a tie, because I couldn't go into the parliament without having the nice clothes. And I had to get a special tag or card so that I can go into the parliament. So on Mondays, when it was the politicians' day off, Moses and I would go get on our knees in the parliament and cry out to God for Finland. And that was Mondays, our Mondays. And we went and prayed for all the politicians. And we prayed that God's will would be done. And we prayed as they were making decisions for laws of the nations of Finland. And very powerful, lots of tears. But we really became one, Antero and I. And then we started to pray that the church would be revived. And of course, Moses knew that I was praying for the revival and unity of the body of Christ. And that's what Moses had on his heart, Antero Laukkasen. He really wanted to see the unity and revival in Finland too. So we agreed together every week, all the time, for this revival to come. And then at one time, I have a photo here of when all the Nordic countries were coming together to meet in the Finnish parliament with the crosses in their flag. And we were praying at the same time that God would bring unity within the Nordic nations, even through the churches. And it wasn't long after that all these Nordic prayer movements and churches coming together to pray in the Nordic. And then they had a day of repentance where 1,200 spiritual leaders and priests and pastors came and knelt down on the steps of the parliament to pray and ask God to forgive them for complaining and criticizing their leaders instead of praying for them. So they repented. This is how revival starts. And it was so exciting to see that the Helsinki Sanomat took a photo of that and put it on the front page of Helsinki Sanomat. That's exciting. You know that the media is doing something right when they do that. And so to me, that was a sign of revival, that God is moving. And then my wife and I, we prayed from Helsinki to Utsjoki and from Joensuu to Vasa. We prayed for every city and town in Finland. We had a map. And for 3 weeks, we drove through Finland praying for every city and town. And the bigger towns, cities, we would pray around, praying for revival, praying that God would move. And when we were up in Utsjoki, this is just one of the signs. My wife was waking up in the night, and she just knew that there was darkness in that hotel room. I mean, we've been praying all day long for the different cities and towns as we were going all the way through Lapland. And then when we got to Utsjoki, we were staying in a hotel there. And my wife she woke me up and said that there's something very evil in this place that's trying to attack me. And so I got up and we started to pray together. And then I saw a vision. God speaks through visions and dreams to me and to my wife. And I saw a vision of the bride of Christ. Finland is like a dancing bride. And Russia had taken away one of the arms that belonged to Finland and part of the dress. But it's a dancing bride. But the revival, all those who got saved up in Lapland, this great revival, the greatest revival in all Nordic history, it was bound, and there's all kinds of bad things that happened in that revival, sadly. But every revival burns out, at least in the past. They don't keep going. And so there's a lot of bad things, bad talk about this Lestodian church and revival and splits and all this kind of, but so many churches have splits. But I saw this bride bound by ropes, which speaks of rich witchcraft. And so, God has given us authority to trample upon serpent and scorpion and all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall injure us. When we are doing God's will, God spoke so clearly to us to pray for every city and town in Finland. So we were just obeying what the Holy Spirit was leading us to do. And so we asked God how to pray. And we, in Jesus' name, we broke the witchcraft, demonic witchcraft that was going on, binding God's people up in Lapland, in the north. And there's so much depression and suicide up there now. And then after that happened, there was an earthquake. The earthquake center was not in Utsjoki, but it was in Mornio. But it affected the whole Lapland. There's not too many earthquakes up there in the north. But I believe God was speaking something, that there's a stronghold of witchcraft, and something broke because of that prayer that we prayed. And then we prayed all the way, and I have lots of stories of different signs like that happened. God was showing us strongholds that the enemy had. The enemy is able to be in places because of innocent bloodshed, curses, murder, rape, all these kind of demonic things. If they have not been repented of and asked forgiveness for, then the enemy has a right to be there. Where people have invited, like the witches and Satan worshipers invite the darkness to come and give them power. And so when they are invited, the enemy will be there. The dark powers of darkness will be there. It says in Ephesians chapter 6 that we don't fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of evil that we cannot see. It's a spiritual battle, not a physical battle. And so we were trying to go find these places, and then we would pray God's healing of the land. Repent, just like Moses did. Repent of the sins of our forefathers. And Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6 said that I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live amongst a people of unclean lips. And he repented. He took on that cultural or the national sin upon himself and asked forgiveness. And that's what the job of the priest, or like Moses. Moses stood in the gap. God is searching for somebody, it says in Ezekiel 22, who will stand in the gap and make intercession, ask forgiveness for the sins of the people. And that was the job of the priest. In the Old Testament, they had to offer sacrifices. They had to kill animals. But in the New Testament, we have the Lamb of God who was slain from the foundation of the world. Jesus Christ, he was the last and final sacrifice that covers all sin, all the guilt and pain. He died and broke every curse. He became the curse, like it says in Philippians chapter 2, so that we can be set free of all curses and all the powers of darkness and the enemy. So this is what we did. And so this was signs of that revival that I believe that God was showing me, that he's making ready, just like John the Baptist. He came before Jesus, preparing the road in the wilderness, making the straight the road, every crooked path straight and every rough road smooth, so that preaching repentance, that the people would get their hearts right with God. And then Jesus came. And it's the same thing. Jesus is about to come back. And we are about to see, like it's promised in Joel, that he will pour out his Spirit over all flesh. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. And we will start, I'm starting to see that happen, where young people are starting to get filled with the Holy Spirit. And they are starting to pray. They're starting to get excited about Jesus. I remember when I first came here to Siljaarvi, that I noticed that 14, 15-year-olds were out on the streets smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol, getting drunk. And I thought, this is not your will, God. I pray that your will would be done, that you would turn this around. And I would speak that scripture out from Joel chapter 2, that this is what's going to happen in Finland, that our sons and daughters will start to prophesy, that the Spirit of God is going to be poured over the schools. I thank God for Ricky Rinne, who is going around in the schools and preaching and teaching these children how to know Jesus. And I'm praying for him all the time that there would be revivals in these schools, everywhere he goes and where other evangelists goes in the schools. Because that's God's will, that the teenagers are not drinking alcohol, getting drunk with wine, but they'd be filled with the Holy Spirit. That's what the Bible says. Don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. And so on Friday nights, I would go and I'd pray around the streets, pray for these young people. And then in the free church, we started to invite these children, the young people, to come. And we started to make bula and sambulas and coffee and tea and invite them to come in. And at the beginning, they were not interested. But after a while, a couple came and they brought their beer cans, with them. And I said, well, just put your beer cans outside and come on in. And they come and they drink coffee, have some donuts and eat some pirkka or whatever and was offered. And then they went out and they started to tell all their friends. So before you know it, there was about 60, 70 young people coming to the free church every Friday night. And, that's where their meeting place was. So they would come in for a while. They would hear us, some of our discipleship training school students sharing their testimony, leading the worship, but they were not so interested in the music and the preaching. So they would come in and out, and many of them came in drunk, and they would cause a little trouble. But the thing is that they were hearing the gospel. They were hearing the good news. It was like seeds being planted into their broken hearts, their wounded hearts. So many of them came from abandoned or, divorced families. Their fathers had left. But God was started to move in their hearts. And then I remember one night, this one young man came to me and said that, please pray for my father. He tried to kill himself. So I prayed for his father. And then a couple weeks later, he came to me and he said, thank you for praying that my father is better now. And then he thanked us for caring for them. He said that so many of these, my friends, their mothers and fathers, they don't care for them. They're drunk, or they don't live at home. They go out and they're come from divorced families. And he said that, but you guys care for us. And he just thanked us. He said he's sorry that they're not good kids, but he said it's so important that you're here. And then fights started to break out outside, and the police came, but the police would come almost every Friday night because they knew where the trouble was going to be. It was going to be at the free church in Siljaarvi. So that became the young people's hangout. And that's where all the drinking and smoking and all the bad stuff happened, was in front of the free church, But then they decided that to come into the church, they would have to blow the alcohol test. And once they started to do that, then one by one, they started to leave, and they never came back. Only the good kids came. I said, this is the reason why we need this coffee house, is for those unsaved people, not the saved ones. Remember, we need to be the street lights, not the church lights. And it's so wonderful that all these young people feel like we love and care for them, even though they cause trouble. But we caused trouble too when we were not saved. That God loved us, and He forgave us, and He will forgive them. And so, that was an exciting sign for me that the young people are starting to be open for God. Another example was in Sweden, when I was asked to be a leader in the YWAM school in the center in close to Göteborg, between Göteborg and Uddevalla. And I was running prayer schools there, and we had an all-night prayer meeting where we prayed all night long, 24/7. And the next day I was so tired I just wanted to go to sleep. And one of the young people came and knocked on my door and said, Mark, there's going to be a great confirmation camp, rippikoulu, down at the big Lutheran church. About 200 young people are going to be there. Can you come with us? I said, no, I'm too tired. I was up all night long and I'm wiped out. But I'll pray for you guys, I said. A little while later, another one came and knocked on the door. Mark, will you come with us to the rippikoulu confirmation big camp where all the confirmation schools are coming together in this big Lutheran church? I said, no, I'm too tired, but if you need a car, you can borrow my car, I said. And then, but they didn't need a car. They just wanted me to come. And I prayed and I said, Lord, if you really want me to go, send somebody else. Not too long after that, another knock on the door. And I said, okay, I'll go. So I went there, huge Lutheran church, packed with young people, over 200 young people. And then I just felt like God spoke to me that these are like sheep without a shepherd. And all of a sudden, God's love and compassion came over me like such a heavy burden. And I prayed, prayer of faith, Lord, don't let any of these young people leave this building tonight without being touched by your Holy Spirit. And then the meeting began. And right after the meeting began, one not too far from me, a young lady, she was like getting attacked by something. I don't know if it's epilepsy or something, but she was just rolling around and shaking and it looked like, she was really desperate for help. So they called an ambulance, and when the ambulance was coming, then some of them asked me, Mark, can you pray for her? So I just went over there, simple prayer, in Jesus' name, be healed. She was instantly healed, and everybody's watching, this happen. And they said, wow, what just happened? I mean, she went from rolling around and being totally insane to totally peaceful and quiet. I don't know if it was a demon or something that went out of her, but anyway, she was completely normal. And then they said, Mark, would you like to speak to us? So the meeting that I had no plans on going to, all of a sudden I became the guest speaker. And I went up there and I just started to share the love of Christ and how God transformed my life, just like I shared to you earlier. And then God started to move amongst them. Then I said, do any of you want to know Jesus in a personal way? Because this was a Lutheran confirmation camp, and most of them are there because they get money from the rippikoulu. And so I said, if you really want to know Jesus, come up and we'll pray for you. And 70 young people that night got saved. And then we started get in contact with them. So we started with the revival. That was the spiritual awakening. And then we started to teach them. They started to come to our DTSs. And one of them, he pioneered a ministry in North India to an unreached people group and changed that part of India. And then now he's in a part of a place in the Caucasus mountain regions, reaching the unreached people groups there. God transformed his life, and now he's going out and transforming people, preaching the gospel and discipling people who have never heard about Jesus. That is God's will for us, to transform nations. And that's the signs of revival here in the Nordic countries. Hello, friends. I want to talk to you about revival. I want you to know that revival is coming to Finland. And actually, it's already started. And that's what I'll be teaching about, is the little signs of revival that I've seen in the north, south, east, and west of Finland as I've been praying for every city and town in Finland and seeing what God is doing. God wants you to know. And this generation is a visual generation. And the young people, they want to see God moving. They don't want to just hear about it, what's happening in Africa or someplace else. They want to actually see it with their own eyes. And TV7 is going to bring this news to you that you can share, and that these young people can start to see that God is moving in a powerful way, even in Finland. And if you would like to support this ministry and get this visual generation, the messages that they can actually see what God is doing, and get them understanding that God is moving right now, not just someplace in the future, then they will get excited and they will want to come and listen and come to know this Jesus that is moving around them. That young people are coming to Christ more than ever before in this nation. And we need to believe that this is the generation that is seeking after God. So they will show you how you can support this ministry of TV7. God bless you.